Allow me to preface this episode by saying how happy I am to have you here, because I know for a fact that you've heard thousands of people talking about repurposing content and how important it is to squeeze the juice out of every single piece you create online. And at this point, you are a bit skeptical, but you still decided to give this episode a chance. So thank you and welcome. You're in for a treat. Today, you will learn that you, in fact, can turn your old newsletters, blog posts, LinkedIn posts, or even Instagram captions into a podcast episode without wasting half of your week in the process. Actually, my guest today would tell you that not only can you, but maybe you should, and she will tell you exactly why. I'm joined by Corinne McKay, a translator, interpreter, trainer, and longtime freelancer who has built her podcast called Training for Translators entirely on repurposed content. Even more interestingly, she openly tells her listeners that her episodes come from blog posts she had already written, and it's clear as day that everyone's on board because she regularly pulls in hundreds of listeners every single month. In this conversation, you will find out why repurposing is not a sign of laziness, why your audience probably doesn't consume content the way you think they do, and why creating everything from scratch might be the biggest obstacle standing between you and a sustainable podcast. And if by the end you like what you hear, you end up being a repurposing convert, but still wonder, okay, how do I actually do this? Don't worry, we got you. We'll get practical in the episode following this one. Let's go. This is Say Yes to Podcasting, where solopreneurs learn how to start podcasts that attract their ideal clients and do the marketing for them. I'm your host, Anja Lordanic. Say Yes to Podcasting today. We all know that people mention the term repurposing all the time nowadays when it comes to content and when it comes to podcast episode creation for aspiring and current podcasters. That can be a hit or miss. People don't know where to start, but in reality, that could be a secret weapon for them. So actually today, Corinne and I are going to talk about why podcasters should stop creating everything from scratch and why that is actually beneficial for them. So let's start at the very beginning. So many podcasters feel pressure to constantly come up with new ideas. And I was wondering, why do you think that's the wrong way to think about content creation?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't so much say wrong way as that I think it's a completely valid option to only repurpose. So for example, I have a podcast that I just released the 26th episode yesterday, and I only repurpose. The podcast consists of no new content. And I think that the two reasons are because you would like to have a podcast, but you don't have the time. Well, I kind of hate saying like don't have the time because all of us get the same 24 hours in the day, right? Either because you'd like to have a podcast, but you don't want to allocate the time to doing episodes from scratch, or because you just want to give people an option of a different medium in which to consume your information. And I would say both of those apply to me, that I don't really want to allocate the time that it takes to do a podcast with episodes from scratch or interview episodes. And I find that a lot of people, which I think we'll probably talk about later, just want to consume the same information in a different way. So I think those are the two main reasons.
Yeah, that's the key point, what you mentioned, because people consume content in different ways. And many people are actually used to audio, but not in the way that they might think. Because whenever we talk to people one-to-one in person, we're actually exchanging audio, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. That's actually an excellent point. You're right. Yeah.
When we're sharing voice messages with our friends or acquaintances or even coaches, that's an audio medium.
Yes. You're right. That's brilliant. Great observation.
And what kinds of existing content are people sitting on right now that could easily become podcast episodes? Let's start there because that's very practical.
Right. So I think that the obvious ones are things you've already written out. So blog posts, newsletters, articles, anything you've written could easily become a podcast because you can just read it. Um, and I think one thing, if you feel like, oh, I don't really want to do that, at least here in the U.S., all of the major American newspapers now have some audio component where the reporter just reads the article. So I think it's a totally valid thing that anything you've written, just read it and call it a podcast. That's your simplest place to start. Then I think I don't do this, but you see a lot of people now who turn their online trainings into podcasts. Like if any of your listeners, Anya, are members of Josh Goldsmith's Tech Forward platform, one thing he does that I really like is every time he does an online training, I'm sure he does this in some automated way. He just also releases it as a podcast that goes into your private podcast feed. And personally, as an audio person, I really appreciate that, even though I'm missing the video. So for any of your listeners who do online training, think about doing that. Just even if it's something that you did as a webinar with slides, just release the audio because people who like audio will listen to it anyway. And then I think you expand the universe of what you could do. For example, LinkedIn posts. If you have LinkedIn posts that you wrote, don't be afraid to expand on something short and make it a little bit longer. First, read out the LinkedIn post and then maybe read some of the comments. I mean, LinkedIn's public anyway, right? So read out the LinkedIn post, read some of the comments, and then talk about it a little bit. So I think one thing is that people feel really constrained by this idea of like, oh, my podcast has to be this really formal, practiced, engineered kind of thing. And when Yves Baudin and I had a podcast at like the dawn of podcasting, we had a podcast where we just sat there and talked to each other.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it was quite popular. So I think part of it is, right, there are going to be some people who don't want to listen to sort of an informal podcast where you read your LinkedIn posts and comment on them, but some people will. And so I think the thing that I would say is if you would like to start a podcast, but you envision it as like a 10-hour a week commitment, start out with something that literally takes you an hour. That's about how long each episode of my podcast. And I do everything myself. So from beginning to end, each episode takes me about an hour. And like, you've got an hour. You know what I mean? Like, you waste an hour watching cat videos anyway. So you have an hour.
I believe a lot of people just are feeling called out just now. I mean, I watch dog videos instead of cat videos, but cats also are a part of my algorithm.
Right, exactly.
We're going to dig deeper into the how, but I just wanted to note here how brilliant your LinkedIn post idea is, because as you said, you can read out the comments out loud, and that makes your episode interactive, as if you're not recording it by yourself.
Exactly.
And that's brilliant. And I do this for a living, and I have never heard someone say this, like read the post out loud and then the comments.
There we go. And really any thinking about that, any social media platform that people comment on, you could like make a podcast out of your Instagram. You know, if you have people commenting on it, you know, say like, I'm just going to do a 6-minute episode where I'm going to read you my most recent Instagram post and some of the reactions to it. If you have a Substack, really anything. So I think the main thing is expand your idea of what could become a podcast, because people who like audio will listen to it. And personally, I like really short podcast episodes. I mean, I listen to long ones too, but I think don't be thinking you could even do something that's 6 minutes. And to me, I would think, okay, it's 6 minutes. I'm going to listen to this while I wash the dishes to motivate myself to do that.
we're 7 minutes in, and I believe we could call it a day with this episode because people can take away like 3 tips already.
There
And
we
I don't
go.
want to, I don't want to
I'm
overwhelm
all about
people,
the
but
I'm all about the practical tips here.
yeah. Same here. We're like, let's get to the how, but we're going to do that
Exactly.
in our next episode.
Yes.
But I'm so glad you mentioned other platforms as well, because not everyone is on LinkedIn, not everyone is on Instagram. Maybe some people
Right.
have either or both. And to take advantage of them is such a great way of repurposing content while respecting the medium you are on. So
Right.
when you're reading your LinkedIn post out loud, you're probably not going to do that verbatim. You're going to add in
Right.
additional thoughts, comment on those
Exactly.
comments you're seeing, and you're going to make that episode your own. And I
Right.
want to talk about those different platforms, especially blogs, because you are reading your own blog post for your podcast, which is a monthly podcast. We haven't
That's right.
mentioned that yet.
Yep, that's
So
right.
you're allocating an hour a month, but I would argue that most of us could allocate an hour a week for our podcast and make it a weekly podcast, right?
It's
This is
true.
what I
Hmm.
suggest to my clients if they want to make their podcast an extension of their business. So, what benefits have you seen, like personally, from that approach, like repurposing it from your blog post? Have your blog posts become then more popular? Is your website being visited more, or something
Hmm.
else?
So it's sort of hard to say. Like the one thing that I think is really difficult, and you probably have like many ideas about how to do this, Anya. But I think one thing that's difficult about a podcast is you just sort of blast it out there and you can look at the download statistics, but that's about it. Because people can't really react in any easy way other than like, follow me, give me a like online, things like that. But the thing that I would say is I feel like I mean, you probably already communicate this to your audience that people who listen to your podcast are going to tell you that they feel like they know you, right?
Mm.
That's the real benefit I've seen is that my podcast gets only a small fraction of the traffic to my blog, for example. My most popular podcast episode has like 1,100 downloads, and I would say that
Wow.
the average one is more like 400. So that's a tiny fraction. Like I have 5,000 subscribers to my newsletter and I have about a 30% open rate. So that's more than 1,000 people who are actually reading my newsletter each week. But I would say when you compare those 1,000 people to the, couple hundred who listen to my podcast, every time I meet someone in person at a conference who listens to my podcast, they say like, I feel like we're already friends because
Yeah.
because I have your voice in my head. Or sometimes when I have a business dilemma, I can actually hear you saying what I think you would say if I asked you the question. So I think it's a much more personal relationship. And personally, I think that you tap into a different audience because you tap into people who like to listen. Because I think these days you've got listen, read, watch, right? Is people's preference for how to communicate information to listen to it, to read it, or to watch it. And so I think you're tapping into your people who like to listen, which is a different audience than your people who like to read or watch.
Mm. And you mentioned having around 1,000 people reading your newsletters versus 400 to 500 people listening to your podcast episodes. And even
Mm-hmm.
though there might be overlap in those consumers, I believe and I know that podcast listeners behave differently compared to email readers or skimmers or non-openers.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
when we are listening to someone, as you said, you're getting this personal and intimate experience with them. You're getting to know them. And I would much rather have 100 podcast listeners every week than 500 email subscribers who are kind of there, but not there. So the quality of the listeners is so important. And the fact that you have multiple in the hundreds every month or with every episode is commendable. And people tend to forget
Thanks.
that. Imagine
Yeah.
400 to 500 people gathering every month to hear something that you're saying.
Right. Oh my gosh, you're so right. I feel better already.
Yeah, that's like a mini conference every
Yes,
month.
exactly. Right. Exactly.
So now that we covered a lot of ground, I would like for us to talk about what others might be looking to implement right now. So, what would you say to a podcaster who worries that repurposing content is somehow quote unquote cheating or giving people recycled or reused material. We already touched on this, but how would you explain this further?
Yeah, so I think there's a few ways to look at it. I struggled with this also, and in the end, I decided, you know what, I'm just going to be honest about what I'm doing here. That I even say on, if you've listened to any of my podcast episodes, I even say this episode is based on a post that I published on my blog on May 13th, 2026. If you'd like to read it instead of listening to it, just go there. So I think that the other question is, what are you going to actually do? For myself, I thought like people had been asking for a podcast for a long time, like, oh, why don't you do a podcast? And I just thought realistically, I don't want to allocate the time that it takes to do an interview podcast. Maybe at a different point in my life, but not right now. And then I think, as I said, so I live in the US, and here I think I'm an avid reader of the New York Times. And I just noticed in the past year or so that more and more of their podcast episodes are just reporters. Like they pick a story every week that they call the Great Read. And the reporter and the reporter says, now I'm going to read you my article. Like
The great speak.
right. They don't try to make it seem like anything that it is not. The reporter just says, right, this is Corinne McKay. I'm a journalist for the New York Times. And I wrote an article about, like transgender beauty queens in Ecuador. And now I'm going to read you my story. And they just sit there and read it. So I think that it's becoming seen as like increasingly legitimate to acknowledge like people absorb information in all different ways, and you're just giving them another option.
And there is something very specific about the audio medium, because when you're repurposing content from text to speech, you're not giving your listeners garbage. You're enhancing what you already created. So it's not like you're cheating or creating something that is less than. You're actually enhancing the experience with your voice and inflections and accent and so forth.
Yeah. So I would say that I would encourage people, to whatever level you feel comfortable, just be honest about it. Just tell people, this podcast is based on a LinkedIn post that I wrote a couple of weeks ago that generated a lot of comments. So I'm going to read you the post and then read you the comments and offer, some things that this made me think about after reading people's comments on it.
Yeah. And when you call it out, it's all on the table. It's
totally.
Like you have nothing to hide, and people know what to expect. And that's, I think, the beauty of intros such as yours, because I dislike, to avoid using a stronger word, I dislike drawn out intros. Like we're getting to the point of the episode at minute 5 at minute 8.
I've already logged off by then. I have no patience for that.
We are done.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not even still listening. Like if they're still introducing themselves and selling their stuff at minute 6, I'm not even still listening. So I'm totally with you on that one.
And fun fact, since I have a podcast about podcasting, I often share like practical tips, of course. And whenever I have my own CTA coming up, I call it out. Because and then I explain why I did that at the point I did it. And I get comments and messages from people saying, I really appreciate that. I love how you weave that in and you explain the process behind it.
I think you're brilliant. And because I do the same thing that I say on every podcast episode, if you like this podcast, you should subscribe to my newsletter. Why? Because the podcast is based on the newsletter. So if you like this podcast, I am in fact sure that you would enjoy my newsletter.
Exactly. I agree completely. And I want the listeners to walk away with one single thought after listening to this episode, because we shared a lot and we agree on everything when it comes to repurposing. But what is like the biggest mindset shift someone will have to go through to change their mind or to believe in repurposing when it comes to podcasting?
So I would say just for anyone who is a freelancer or business owner, which I would assume is most of your listeners, one of the things that I think is most important is do more with what you already have in every way. Like everyone gets excited about a new idea and creating new stuff. But I think that one of the most important business efficiency tips, if you want to call it that, is do more with what you've already got. And that I think repurposing is a key part of that.
I think it's clear as day that we have established that repurposing is not lazy. Actually, quite the contrary. It can be a very smart business move. And most people are already sitting on dozens of podcast episodes. And the fact is, as you said at the very start, they're just not calling them podcast episodes. Just turn on the mic, start recording, call them podcast episode, because you absolutely can do that. In our next episode, we're going to talk about what that actually looks like in practice, so you can do the same and you can take away the tips you need for your own business.
Great.
If today's conversation changed the way you think about repurposing, then our job here is done, at least for now. Hopefully, you're now looking at your existing content and seeing potential podcast episodes everywhere. That's at least what happens to me all the time. So my brain mostly juggles between daycare pickups, diaper changes, and podcast episode ideas. Make of that what you will. Anyway, to give you a bit of a teaser for next week, like Netflix does so masterfully, in the next episode, Corinne and I get practical, and I mean really practical. We'll walk through exactly how to choose the right type of content, turn one idea into multiple episodes, and create a podcast workflow that doesn't take over your life, but one that is really sustainable and exactly right for you. I'll see you then.